Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something that's really been whipping the economic news cycle into a frenzy lately. We're talking about the recent, pretty dramatic shifts in U.S. trade policy under President Trump. Specifically, we're going to dissect the initial rollout and then that partial pullback of tariffs we saw.
That's right. And we're basing this on analysis and reporting you might have seen floating around on MSNBC, featuring financial experts, journalists reacting to it all.
Exactly. And for you, our listener, the idea here is to sort of cut through the daily headlines, We want to help you really understand the core of these rapid changes, the intense reactions we saw in the markets, and, well, what it all means for the bigger picture.
Yeah, trying to get past the noise.
So our mission today, if you will, is to figure out why these tariffs were first put in place, what actually prompted this surprising pause, why the markets reacted so strongly.
Both ways, really. Down and then up.
Right. Both ways. And what the lasting impact could actually be, even with these, adjustments now in play. Okay, so let's get right into it. Those initial tariffs, where did this start?
So, as reported, the Trump administration went ahead and implemented some, well, pretty significant tariffs. These are basically, taxes on imported goods. And what we saw almost immediately was a sharp downturn in the markets. Many people were calling it a market crash.
Yeah, I remember the reporting. It really painted a picture of genuine market panic, a lot of instability very suddenly. We're talking about major market indexes seeing swings of like 1% or more in a single day, which sounds small, maybe. But
it's huge. In terms of value, it's massive, and it signals a lot of investor anxiety.
Exactly. It sounds like it was a very unsettling time for the markets.
It certainly was, and this increased volatility, this sort of up and down action, seemed to be a direct consequence of these new trade barriers being put up. And interestingly, this all happened not long after the president had reportedly discussed his trade strategy, at length. So maybe not entirely unexpected within the administration itself.
Okay. Which perhaps makes what happened next even more surprising, right?
Right.
Because just recently, President Trump announced a, quote, pause on implementing further reciprocal tariffs. And maybe just quickly, reciprocal tariffs that's when one country hits back with tariffs because another country put tariffs on them first.
Exactly. Tit for tat. So instead of that escalating further, the level was brought down to what's being called a universal 10% tariff.
A universal 10%. Okay.
Now, what's fascinating here, or maybe confusing depending on your perspective, is that this new 10% level reportedly emerged after President Trump and his key aides had, well, very recently indicated they weren't considering new tariffs. So this looks like a pretty swift change of direction, a pivot.
And what's maybe even more noteworthy, according to the reports we looked at, is that this pause apparently didn't come because of some clear, tangible concession from other countries. It wasn't like, okay, you give us this, we'll pause the tariffs.
Right. There wasn't a specific announced agreement or, a diplomatic win that seemed to trigger this change of heart, at least not publicly.
Okay.
And this lack of a clear trigger makes the market reaction that followed all the more interesting. Because the announcement of this pause, this shift to a 10% universal tariff, it sparked what was widely described as a huge rebound in the markets. We saw some really significant gains very quickly.
Absolutely. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, it was reported to have jumped by as much as 900 points at one point. That's massive.
Huge swing.
And you had these seasoned financial journalists on air, people who've seen it all, basically expressing disbelief. Like, is this real? Wow.
Yeah.
That kind of gut reaction really tells you something about the magnitude of the market's response, doesn't it? How unexpected this shift was.
Yeah, it really does. That level of surprise, it just underscores how much relief washed over the market. This rebound is largely being seen as a relief rally, like a positive reaction, because the worst case scenario, those initial more aggressive tariff threats were being scaled back.
Like the pressure valve was suddenly eased a bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Phew. But, and this feels like a really crucial point coming out of the analysis, even with that big market bounce, the financial experts featured on MSNBC, they seem to have some pretty serious, persistent concerns about this new 10% tariff level.
Yes, definitely. Despite the market relief, many experts view this universal 10% tariff as still fairly unsustainable in the long run. They're calling it a massive reordering of U.S. trade and global trade. It's not seen as, a stable endpoint.
It's not exactly a good outcome, just less bad than feared.
Pretty much. They still see it as a big bad deal and a seismic shift to global trade norms. I mean, think about it. Even a 10% tax on almost everything imported can significantly impact business costs.
And how they price things for us.
Exactly, which brings up that concept you mentioned earlier.
Right, the Trump tax. Can you break that down a little more?
Sure, the Trump tax, it's essentially this idea that even with this partial rollback, American consumers, ordinary people, will likely still end up paying higher prices for goods because tariffs on imports, they often just get passed down the supply chain. Businesses pay more, wholesalers pay more.
And eventually it hits the price tag at the store.
Precisely. So even a 10% tariff, if it's applied broadly, could mean increased costs for everyday items. It adds up.
Right, so even though maybe some tariffs were higher initially, this universal 10% could still have a really broad impact on what things cost us day to day.
Exactly. And the reporting emphasizes that even with this adjustment, the U.S. is still, relatively speaking, a tariff-heavy industrialized country. So while it's a step back from the brink, maybe the overall tariff situation is still pretty significant compared to many of our trading partners.
And the experts they featured, they didn't seem to be pulling any punches in their assessment, did they? Some were quoted viewing this whole episode as a self-induced American economic disaster without much clear upside.
Yes.
That's strong language.
It is very strong. And it connects to a really interesting psychological idea some analysts brought up, the anchoring effect.
Anchoring effect.
Yeah, the idea is that by first floating these really high tariffs, the later reduction to 10% feels like a huge improvement, even if 10% itself is still economically damaging. It's like if someone first tells you a repair will cost $1,000 and then says, oh, wait, actually, it's only $500. You feel relieved.
Wow, you feel like you got a deal.
Even if $500 is still objectively a lot of money, that first high number, the $1,000, it anchors your perception of the $500.
Yeah, that's a really insightful way to frame it. So the initial shock of, say, 25% or higher tariffs might have made this 10% seem palatable, almost.
Or at least less terrifying, yeah. But beyond just the specific numbers, it sounds like the broader takeaway is that President Trump's trade policies, this whole approach, has injected a significant amount of ongoing uncertainty into the markets.
That word keeps coming up. Uncertainty.
Precisely. And experts are asking a pretty fundamental question now. Why would other countries want to deepen their trade ties with the U.S. after seeing such abrupt, significant tariff actions? This kind of unpredictability, it can really damage trust. It might encourage countries to, look elsewhere for more stable trading partners, diversify away.
Interestingly, though, the MSNBC reporting did note that President Trump claimed other countries were reaching out, looking to make deals right after this announcement.
Yes.
So it's a bit of a contrasting perspective there to the experts' concerns about damaged relationships, almost like two different narratives playing out.
Right. You have the White House narrative and then the external analyst narrative. And this actually brings us neatly to the whole story around why President Trump made this move, why the pause. Multiple sources, including big outlets like the New York Times, ran headlines basically saying Donald Trump backs down.
Which is really notable, isn't it? Because we've heard such a consistent stance from President Trump himself against lowering tariffs, against backing down on trade disputes. He's often framed it as weakness.
Exactly. So this partial rollback to a universal 10%, it seems to, contradict that previously very firm, unwavering position.
Did the administration offer any reassurance?
Well, the reporting did highlight the Treasury Secretary making a statement basically promising a ceiling on tariffs, suggesting that levels wouldn't go any higher, at least for most countries. China was often mentioned as a potential exception there.
Okay, so an attempt to maybe calm the waters a bit.
Perhaps. But it was also interesting that the White House itself reportedly described the preceding situation as a flailing tariff standoff.
Flailing? That's quite a word.
Yes, a rather candid admission, you might say. And some commentators were definitely characterizing this whole pause as a form of capitulation by the White House, driven by the market reaction.
But it's important to stress, this wasn't a complete reversal, was it?
No, absolutely not. And the reporting was clear on this. It's really important to underscore that significant tariffs are still in place. The underlying trade tensions, the issues that led to the tariffs in the first place, they haven't necessarily just vanished. This 10% universal tariff is still a pretty significant barrier to trade globally.
Which leads us, I guess, to the ongoing negotiations, this 90-day pause. It's explicitly tied to these continuing discussions with other countries, right?
That's the framework, yes.
So even with this apparent step back, this pause, the situation is far from over.
Yeah.
And that applies not just to China, but to our trade relationships more broadly.
That's the critical point here. The uncertainty that's been generated by all these tariff threats, it's likely to linger. It doesn't just disappear because of a pause. As one of the financial experts on MSNBC put it quite memorably, he said, "You can't really put the tariff threat toothpaste back in the tube."
Huh. That was a good one. Once it's out there.
Once the threat's been made so credibly, the possibility of future tariff actions, future study changes, it's going to continue to influence how markets behave and how international trade dynamics play out. That shadow remains.
Okay, so let's try and bring this all together for you, our listener. What it boils down to is this. President Trump's administration put significant tariffs in place, causing, well, considerable disruption and a market downturn. Then after a period of real market anxiety and volatility, there was this partial rollback, bringing the tariff level down to a universal 10%. Now, while the markets reacted positively, that relief rally we talked about, the financial experts analyzing all this, they remain deeply concerned about the long-term sustainability and the broader impact of these remaining tariffs.
And the uncertainty.
And the huge amount of uncertainty that's been injected into global trade.
Exactly. And just looping back to our mission for this deep dive, hopefully you now have a much clearer picture of this really complex sequence of events. You understand the immediate market reactions, both the panic and the relief, and you've heard the informed perspectives of financial experts on the potential lasting consequences, even with these recent adjustments.
Right. So here's a final thought to maybe chew on as we wrap up. Considering these rapid, sometimes contradictory shifts in U.S. trade policy, how might this whole episode influence the long-term stability of global economic relationships? What does it do to the established norms of international trade? Even if the immediate market reaction to the pause seemed positive, what does this tell us about the potential for, future policy changes like this and their ripple effects through the global economy?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it?
It certainly is. Definitely something worth keeping an eye on as things inevitably continue to unfold.